Little House on the Prairie series by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Book 2, Little House on the Prairie. Chapter 10, A Roof and a Floor. All day long, every day, Laura and Mary were busy. When the dishes were washed and the beds made, there was always plenty to do and to see and to listen to. They hunted for birds' nests in the tall grass, and when they found them, the mother birds squawked and scolded. Sometimes they touched a nest gently, and all in an instant a nest full of downiness became a nest full of wide-gaping beaks hungrily squawking. Then the mother birds scolded like anything, and Mary and Laura quickly went away, because they did not want to worry her too much. In the tall grass they lay still as mice and watched flocks of little prairie chickens running and pecking around their anxiously clucking, smooth brown mothers. They watched striped snakes rippling between the grass stems or lying so still that only their tiny flickering tongues and glittering eyes showed that they were alive. They were garter snakes and would not hurt anybody, but Laura and Mary did not touch them. Ma said snakes were best left alone, because some snakes would bite, and it was better to be safe than sorry. And sometimes there'd be a great gray rabbit, so still in the lights and shadows of a grass clump that you were near enough to touch him before you saw him. Then, if you were very quiet, you might stand a long time looking at him. His round eyes stared at yours without meaning anything. His nose wiggled, and sunlight was rosy through his long ears that had delicate veins in them and the softest short fur on their outsides. The rest of his fur was so thick and soft that at last you couldn't help trying very carefully to touch it. Then he was gone in a flash, and the place where he had been sitting was hollowed and smooth and still warm from his warm behind. All the time, of course, Laura or Mary was minding baby Carrie, except when she had her afternoon nap. Then they sat and soaked in the sunshine and the wind until Laura forgot that the baby was sleeping. She jumped up and ran and shouted till Ma came to the door and said, "Dear me, Laura, must you yell like an Indian? I declare," Ma said, "if you girls weren't getting to look like Indians. Can I never teach you to keep your sunbonnets on?" Pa was up on the house wall, beginning the roof. He looked down at them and laughed.
"One little Indian, two little Indians, three little Indians," he sang softly. "No, only two."
"You make three," Mary said to him. "You're brown, too." "But you aren't little, Pa," said Laura. "Pa, when are we going to see a papoose?" "Goodness!" Ma exclaimed. "What do you want to see an Indian baby for? Put on your sunbonnet now and forget such nonsense."
Laura's sunbonnet hung down her back. She pulled it up by its strings, and its sides came past her cheeks. When her sunbonnet was on, she could see only what was in front of her, and that was why she was always pushing it back and letting it hang by its strings tied around her throat. She put her sunbonnet on when Ma told her to, but she did not forget the papoose. This was Indian country, and she didn't know why she didn't see Indians. She knew she would see them sometime, though. Pa said so, but she was getting tired of waiting. Pa had taken the canvas wagon top off the house, and now he was ready to put the roof on. For days and days he'd been hauling logs from the creek bottoms and splitting them into thin, long slabs. Piles of slabs lay all around the house, and slabs stood against it.
"Come out of the house, Caroline," he said. "I don't want to risk anything falling on you or on Carrie."
"Wait, Charles, till I put away the China shepherdess," Ma answered. In a minute she came out, with a quilt in her mending and baby Carrie. She spread the quilt on the shady grass by the stable and sat there to do her mending and watch Carrie play. Pa reached down and pulled up a slab. He laid it across the ends of the sapling rafters. Its edge stuck out beyond the wall. Then Pa put some nails in his mouth and took his hammer out of his belt, and he began to nail the slab to the rafters. Mr. Edwards had lent him the nails. They had met in the woods when they were doing both chopping down trees, and Mr. Edwards had insisted that Pa borrow nails for the roof.
"That's what I call a good neighbor,"
Pa said when he told Ma about it. "Yes," said Ma, "but I don't like to be beholden, not even to the best of neighbors."
"Nor I,"
Pa replied.
"I've never been beholden to any man yet, and I never will be."
But neighborliness is another matter, and I'll pay 'em back every nail as soon as I can make the trip to Independence."
Now Pa carefully took the nails one by one from his mouth, and with ringing blows of the hammer he drove them into the slab. It was much quicker than drilling holes and whittling pegs and driving them into the holes, but every now and then a nail sprang away from the tough oak when the hammer hit it, and if Pa was not holding it firmly, it went sailing through the air. Then Mary and Laura watched it fall, and they searched in the grass till they found it. Sometimes it was bent. Then Pa carefully pounded it straight again. It would never do to lose or waste a nail. When Pa had nailed down 2 slabs, he got up on them. He laid and nailed more slabs all the way up to the top of the rafters. The edge of each slab lapped over the edge of the slab below it. Then he began again on the other side of the house, and he laid the roof all the way up from that side. A little crack was left between the highest slabs, so Pa made a little trough of 2 slabs, and he nailed this through firmly, upside down, over the crack. The roof was done. The house was darker than it had been, because no light came through the slabs. There was not one single crack that would let rain come in. "You've done a splendid job, Charles," Ma said, "and I'm thankful to have a good roof over my head."
"You shall have furniture, too, as fine as I can make it," Pa replied. "I'll make a bedstead as soon as the floor is laid."
He began again to haul logs. Day after day he hauled logs. He did not even stop hauling logs to go hunting. He took his gun on the wagon and brought back at night whatever meat he had shot from the wagon seat. When he had hauled enough logs to make the floor, he began to split them. He split each log straight down the middle. Laura liked to sit on the woodpile and watch him. First, with a mighty blow of his axe, he split the butt of the log. Into the crack he slipped the thin edge of an iron wedge. Then he wrenched the axe out of the log, and he drove the wedge deeper into the crack. The tough wood split a little farther. All the way up the log, Pa fought that tough oak. He struck with his axe into the crack. He drove blocks of wood into it and moved the iron wedge higher. Little by little, he followed the crack up the log. He swung the axe high and brought it down with a great swing and a grunt from his chest. The axe whizzed and struck plunk. It always struck exactly where Pa wanted it to. At last, with a tearing, cracking sound, the whole log split. Its 2 halves lay on the ground, showing the tree's pale insides and the darker streak up its middle. Then Pa wiped the sweat from his forehead. He took a fresh grip on the axe, and he tackled another log. One day the last log was split, and next morning Pa began to lay the floor. He dragged the logs into the house and laid them one by one, flat side up. With his spade he scraped the ground underneath and fitted the round side of the log firmly down into it. With his axe he hammered away the edge of the bark and cut the wood straight, so that each log fitted against the next, with hardly a crack between them. Then he took the head of the axe in his hand, and with little careful blows he smoothed the wood. He squinted along the log to see that the surface was straight and true. He took off last little bits here and there. Finally he ran his hand over the smoothness and nodded.
"Not a splinter," he said. "That'll be all right for little bare feet to run over."
He left that log fitted in its place and dragged in another. When he came to the fireplace, he used shorter logs. He left a space of bare earth for a hearth, so that when sparks or coals popped out of the fire, they would not burn the floor. One day the floor was done. It was smooth and firm and hard, a good floor of solid oak that would last, Pa said, forever.
"You can't beat a good punchin' floor,"
he said, and Ma said she was glad to be up off the dirt. She put the little China woman on the mantel shelf and spread a red checked cloth on the table. "There," she said, "now we're living like civilized folks again." After that, Pa filled the cracks in the walls. He drove thin strips of wood into them and plastered them well with mud, filling every chink. "That's a good job," Ma said. "That chinking will keep out the wind no matter how hard it blows." Pa stopped whistling to smile at her. He slapped the last bit of mud between the logs and smoothed it and set down the bucket. At last the house was finished.
"I wish we had glass for the windows," Pa said.
"We don't need glass, Charles," said Ma.
Just the same, if I do well with my hunting and trapping this winter, I'm gonna get some glass and Independence next spring, said Pa. And hang the expense.
Glass windows would be nice if we can afford them, Ma said, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it.
They were all happy that night. The fire on the hearth was pleasant, for on the high prairie even the summer nights were cool. The red checked cloth was on the table, the little china woman glimmered on the mantel shelf, and the new floor was golden in the flickering firelight. Outside, the night was large and full of stars. Pa sat for a long time in the doorway and played his fiddle and sang to Ma and Mary and Laura in the house and to the starry night outside. Little House on the Prairie series by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Book 2, Little House on the Prairie. Chapter 11, Indians in the House. Early one morning, Pa took his gun and went hunting. He had meant to make the bedstead that day. He had brought in the slabs when Ma said she had no meat for dinner, so he stood the slabs against the wall and took down his gun. Jack wanted to go hunting too. His eyes begged Pa to take him, and whines came up from his chest and quivered in his throat till Laura almost cried with him. But Pa chained him to the stable.
No, Jack, Pa said. You must stay here and guard the place.
Then he said to Mary and Laura,
Don't let him loose, girls.
Poor Jack lay down. It was a disgrace to be chained, and he felt it deeply. He turned his head from Pa and would not watch him going away with the gun on his shoulder. Pa went farther and farther away till the prairies swallowed him and he was gone. Laura tried to comfort Jack, but he would not be comforted. The more he thought about the chain, the worse he felt. Laura tried to cheer him up, to frisk and play, but he only grew more sullen. Both Mary and Laura felt that they could not leave Jack while he was so unhappy. So all that morning they stayed by the stable. They stroked Jack's smooth, brindled head and scratched around his ears and told him how sorry they were that he must be chained. He lapped their hands a little bit, but he was very sad and angry. His head was on Laura's knee, and she was talking to him, when suddenly he stood up and growled a fierce, deep growl. The hair on his neck stood straight up, and his eyes glared red. Laura was frightened. Jack had never growled at her before. Then she looked over her shoulder, where Jack was looking, and she saw two naked wild men coming, one behind the other, on the Indian trail. "Mary, look!" she cried. Mary looked and saw them too. They were tall, thin, fierce-looking men. Their skin was brownish red. Their heads seemed to go up to a peak, and the peak was a tuft of hair that stood straight up and ended in feathers. Their eyes were black and still and glittering like snakes' eyes. They came closer and closer. Then they went out of sight on the other side of the house. Laura's head turned, and so did Mary's, and they looked at the place where those terrible men would appear when they came past the house. "Indians," Mary whispered. Laura was shivery. There was a queer feeling in her middle, and the bones in her legs felt weak. She wanted to sit down, but she stood and looked and waited for those Indians to come out from behind the house. The Indians did not do that. All this time Jack had been growling. Now he stopped growling and was lunging against the chain. His eyes were red and his lips curled back, and all the hair on his head was bristling. He bounded and bounded clear off the ground, trying to get loose from the chain. Laura was glad that the chain kept him right there with her. "Jack's here," she whispered to Mary. "Jack won't let them hurt us. We'll be safe if we stay close to Jack." "They're in the house," Mary whispered. "They're in the house with Ma and Carrie." Then Laura began to shake all over. She knew she must do something. She did not know what those Indians were doing to Ma and baby Carrie. There was no sound at all from the house. "Oh, what are they doing to Ma?" she screamed in a whisper. "Oh, I don't know," Mary whispered. "I'm going to let Jack loose," Laura whispered hoarsely. "Jack will kill them." "Pa said not to," Mary answered. They were too scared to speak out loud. They put their heads together and watched the house and whispered. "He didn't know Indians would come," Laura said. "He said not to let Jack loose." Mary was almost crying. Laura thought of little baby Carrie and Ma shut in the house with those Indians.
She said, "I'm going in to help Ma." She ran 2 steps and walked a step. Then she turned and flew back to Jack. She clutched him wildly and hung on to his strong, panting neck. Jack wouldn't let anything hurt her. "We mustn't leave Ma in there alone," Mary whispered. She stood still and trembled. Mary never could move when she was frightened. Laura hid her face against Jack and held on to him tightly. Then she made her arms let go. Her hands balled into fists and her eyes shut tight, and she ran toward the house as fast as she could run. She stumbled and fell down, and her eyes popped open. She was up again and running before she could think. Mary was close behind her. They came to the door. It was open, and they slipped into the house without a sound. The naked wild men stood by the fireplace. Ma was bending over the fire, cooking something. Carrie clung to Ma's skirts with both hands, and her head was hidden in the folds. Laura ran toward Ma, but just as she reached the hearth, she smelled a horribly bad smell, and she looked up at the Indians. Quick as a flash, she ducked behind the long, narrow slab that leaned against the wall. The slab was just wide enough to cover both her eyes. If she held her head perfectly still and pressed her nose against the slab, she couldn't see the Indians, and she felt safer. But she couldn't help moving her head just a little, so that one eye peeped out and she could see the wild men. First, she saw their leather moccasins, then their stringy, bare, red-brown legs all the way up. Around their waists, each of the Indians wore a leather thong, and the furry skin of a small animal hung down in front. The fur was striped black and white, and now Laura knew what made that smell. The skins were fresh skunk skins. A knife like Pa's hunting knife and a hatchet like Pa's hatchet were sunk into each skunk skin. The Indians' ribs made little ridges up their bare sides. Their arms were folded on their chests. At last, Laura looked again at their faces, and she dodged quickly behind the slab. Their faces were bold and fierce and terrible. Their black eyes glittered. High on their foreheads and above their ears, where hair grows, these wild men had no hair. But on top of their heads, a tuft of hair stood straight up. It was wound around with string, and feathers were stuck in it. When Laura peeked out from behind the slab again, both Indians were looking straight at her. Her heart jumped into her throat and choked her with its pounding. 2 black eyes glittered down into her eyes. The Indian did not move. Not one muscle of his face moved. Only his eyes shone and sparkled at her. Laura didn't move either. She didn't even breathe. The Indian made 2 short, harsh sounds in his throat. The other Indian made one sound like, "Ha!" Laura hid her eyes behind the slab again. She heard Ma take the cover off the bake oven. She heard the Indians squat down on the hearth. After a while, she heard them eating. Laura peeked and hid and peeked again while the Indians ate the cornbread that Ma had baked. They ate every morsel of it and even picked up the crumbs from the hearth. Ma stood and watched them and stroked baby Carrie's head. Mary stood close behind Ma and held onto her sleeve. Faintly, Laura heard Jack's chain rattling. Jack was still trying to get loose. When every crumb of the cornbread was gone, the Indians rose up. The skunk smell was stronger when they moved. One of them made harsh sounds in his throat again. Ma looked at him with big eyes. She did not say anything. The Indian turned around. The other Indian turned too, and they walked across the floor and out through the door. Their feet made no sound at all. Ma sighed a long, long sigh. She hugged Laura tight in one arm and Mary tight in the other arm, and through the window they watched those Indians going away, one behind the other, on the dim trail toward the west. Then Ma sat down on the bed and hugged Laura and Mary tighter and trembled. She looked sick. "Do you feel sick, Ma?" Mary asked her. "No," said Ma. "I'm just thankful they're gone." Laura wrinkled her nose and said, "They smell awful." "That was the skunk skins they wore," Ma said. Then they told her how they had left Jack and had come into the house because they were afraid the Indians would hurt her and baby Carrie. Ma said they were her brave little girls. "Now we must get dinner," she said. "Pa will be here soon, and we must have dinner ready for him. Mary, bring me some wood. Laura, you may set the table." Ma rolled up her sleeves and washed her hands and mixed cornbread, while Mary brought the wood and Laura set the table. She set a tin plate and a knife and a fork and a cup for Pa, and the same for Ma, with Carrie's little tin cup beside Ma's. And she set tin plates and knives and forks for her and Mary, but only their one cup between the plates. Ma made the cornmeal and water into 2 thin loaves, each shaped in a half circle. She laid the loaves with their straight sides together in the bake oven, and she pressed her hand flat on top of each loaf. Pa always said he did not ask any other sweetening when Ma put the prints of her hands on the loaves. Laura had hardly set the table when Pa was there. He left a big rabbit and 2 prairie hens outside the door and stepped in and laid his gun on the pegs. Laura and Mary ran and clutched him, both talking at once.
What's all this? What's all this?
He said, rumpling their hair.
Indians? So you've seen Indians at last, have you, Laura? I noticed they have a camp in a little valley west of here. Did Indians come to the house, Caroline?
Yes, Charles, 2 of them, Ma said. I'm sorry, but they took all your tobacco and they ate a lot of cornbread. They pointed to the cornmeal and made signs for me to cook some. I was afraid not to. Oh, Charles, I was afraid.
You did the right thing,
Pa told her.
We don't want to make enemies of any Indians.
Then he said,
Whew, what a smell.
They wore fresh skunk skins, said Ma. And that was all they wore.
Must have been thick while they were in here,
Pa said. It was, Charles. We were short of cornmeal, too.
Oh, well, we have enough to hold out a while yet, and our meat is running all over the country. Don't worry, Caroline.
But they took all your tobacco.
Never mind, Pa said. I'll get along without tobacco till I can make the trip to Independence. The main thing is to be on good terms with the Indians. We don't want to wake up some night with a band of screeching
He stopped. Laura dreadfully wanted to know what he had been going to say, but Ma's lips were pressed together, and she shook a little shake of her head at Pa.
Come on, Mary and Laura,
Pa said.
We'll skin that rabbit and dress the prairie hens while that cornbread bakes. Hurry, I'm hungry as a wolf.
They sat on the woodpile in the wind and sunshine and watched Pa work with his hunting knife. The big rabbit was shot through the eye, and the prairie hens' heads were shot clean away. They never knew what hit them, Pa said. Laura held the edge of the rabbit skin while Pa's keen knife ripped it off the rabbit meat.
I'll salt this skin and peg it out on the house wall to dry, he said. It'll make a warm fur cap for some little girl to wear next winter.
But Laura could not forget the Indians. She said to Pa that if they had turned Jack loose, he would have eaten those Indians right up. Pa laid down the knife.
Did you girls even think of turning Jack loose?
He said in a dreadful voice. Laura's head bowed down as she whispered, Yes, Pa.
After I told you not to?
Pa said in a more dreadful voice. Laura couldn't speak, but Mary choked, Yes, Pa. For a moment, Pa was silent. He sighed a long sigh like Ma's sigh after the Indians went away.
After this,
he said in a terrible voice,
you girls remember always to do as you're told. Don't you even think of disobeying me, do you hear?
Yes, Pa, Laura and Mary whispered.
Do you know what would have happened if you had turned Jack loose?
Pa asked. No, Pa, they whispered.
He would have bitten those Indians,
said Pa.
Then there would have been trouble. Bad trouble. Do you understand?
Yes, Pa, they said, but they did not understand. Would they have killed Jack? Laura asked.
Yes, and that's not all. You girls remember this. You do as you're told, no matter what happens.
Yes, Pa, Laura said, and Mary said, Yes, Pa. They were glad they had not turned Jack loose.
Do as you're told,
said Pa,
and no harm will come to you.